All right, guys, well, welcome back to the next edition of some U.S. history review for you. And you're back with DeCecco. We're going to take you through the time period right after World War I. And it's really typically known in U.S. history as the Roaring Twenties. And I mean, as you can see here, it seems like a little party scene over here. You got the women, looks like they're like a little nightclub, a makeshift bar, maybe posing for the picture, shorter dresses. Dudes are all dressed up and dancing. So let's get it going here. There's definitely a change in technology in the 1920s, and that is because the war ended. There was now mass production of more consumer goods for people to buy. There was not much for people to consume or purchase during the war because everything our factories were making, they were making for the war effort. And now we have more consumer goods. So the other thing that kind of comes out in terms of not really a technology, but more of a way of producing, and that is the assembly line. So Henry Ford really perfects the assembly line in his factories in producing automobiles. He produced them so fast and really cut down the cost of production. More and more people were able to buy the actual automobile because its price went down. So there's some actual numbers we'll look at in class in terms of that, but it really lowered the cost of that automobile. And then, once we perfect this assembly line, more and more companies are going to do it in terms of how they're making their products. So there's a boom in a consumer-oriented economy. Once again, nobody was buying anything during the war because there wasn't much to buy. And now there's going to be this really expansive consumer economy where everyone is going to be buying everything. Along with that comes it's kind of a new business flourishes in the 1920s, and that is the advertisements or the advertising agencies begin to put out commercials and banners and posters and things you're going to see along the sides of the roadways that really get people to want these products. So you're going to see these products being advertised, and therefore more and more people are going to buy them. So here, just give you a picture of the assembly line. No longer are we going to be making things in our factories. One guy's going to build the entire car. He's specializing, and he's only going to be doing one thing to build that car. The worker stays in place, and the actual car moves forward, and then he just keeps doing the same thing all day long. And then all these guys are basically doing the same job, and therefore you're able to produce more in a single day. So there you go. There's kind of a little advertisement of the price of the car, Tudor Ford, $580. I mean, the price was well over $1,000, but with the advent of the assembly line, trucks were made, even cars were made much cheaper. So if you ever see this word homogenization, it basically means that everything is the same in society. So it's uniform, or the sameness you'll see throughout society. And basically what we see is that Americans from East Coast to West Coast were using the same products, wearing the same styles, listening to the same music, creating this kind of common culture in the 1920s. And the music, of course, would be jazz, ragtime, blues, and jazz, right? So out of the war effort, and people were working in the cities, but you have the advent of the suburban growth in the 1920s. You'll see this again after World War II in terms of the 1950s and 60s. So more than half of our population was living in urban areas for the first time in American history. So we know early on in our history we predominantly were a farming community, and now really the city growth is kind of taken over. Well, the automobile is going to make it possible for people to be working in these urban areas, but maybe living just beyond the city centers, and they're living in places that are going to be come to be known as the suburbs, or if you really broke that down, the suburban centers of the city. So, you have your major metropolis, your major city life, and just outside that, you have these little living communities that spawn up, and that's where people are choosing to live, of course, if they can afford it, and they can have an automobile to get them in and out of the city. So, you kind of see these little developments, and as you can see, all the houses, I know it's not close, but they all kind of look the same, and these developments are really being built at a fast rate to accommodate for that. People want to work in the city but live somewhere else. But there is some shifting of cultural values in the 20s. So before, if you ever saw like a video or pictures of people in the 1910s or even the late 1800s, everybody's wearing their little top hat and their full suit, black or blue. The women are all wearing long dresses, and they're not really doing much in public. And now, by the 1920s, America has become more of this kind of living in the cities, living in this industrial lifestyle. The city moves a little faster than life does out in the farms and those other outlying communities. So people's lifestyles are going to change. They're going to be a quicker paced lifestyle. Their values and morals may change in terms of the way they dress, freer attitudes towards their sexual experiences, and their manners are a little different. People are a little more harsh and more coarse in their behaviors, right? Well, people's wealth and possessions and having fun became kind of a social thing during the 1920s. So, what also kind of leads to that freer behavior is finally because of our labor laws. I mean, people aren't working 12 to 16-hour days anymore, so they have spare time. So, if you ever see that word leisure time, that's a time where you're not sleeping or you're not at work, and now you're free to do whatever you like. So people in the 20s basically had some extra time, so they used that extra time to do things. And some people went on vacations. Some people went to different movies, and there were silent movies in the early 20s, and later on there were actually talkies, movies that actually people spoke in. So the Ten Commandments, famous movie from the 1920s. The Jazz Singer would be the first movie that had sound. There's a little Charlie Chaplin. He would run around and do goofy things and make people laugh, right? Steamboat Willie, you may know him as just simply Mickey Mouse later on. Mickey Mouse sound cartoon, and Steamboat Willie was the first cartoon that Mickey Mouse was in. Disney was erupted, and people liked it. And this is kind of a scene from the movie set from the Ten Commandments. So people went to the show because they had time, they had a little extra money, and there wasn't a war going on, so they went there. Jazz Singer, another famous movie from the 1920s. So we kind of give you some examples of the types of things people did with their time, right? To continue on that, I mean, obviously, it's still a pastime today. People watch sports. So back in those days, the America's pastime, people went to baseball games. They wanted to see Babe Ruth because, he hit home runs, and, that's what people went to see, right? Charles Lindbergh, famous for being the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean in a solo flight. And then if you were a fan of the boxing, you might know Jack Dempsey from that time period. People with their spare time listened to the radio. Everybody who was anybody had to have a radio in the 1920s. So the new music was jazz or ragtime and blues. And, they had spare time. They played games, bridge, fancy card game, crossword puzzles, mahjong, things like that. That obviously is our baseball legend, Babe Ruth, right? Charles Lindbergh, once again, first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, lands in Paris, comes home a national hero. By the way, this plane is in a museum in Washington, D.C., and there's Jack Dempsey. I wouldn't want to get in front of those two fists. He might knock you out, right? So we mentioned earlier changing cultural values. Well, nothing changed more in the 1920s than the ladies. So the ladies would be in the 1920s, we're going to call flappers. Usually the younger women were dressing and acting like this. It wouldn't be the older women. They were young, very pretty. They had a shorter haircut. It was referred to as a bobbed haircut. Raised hemlines with their skirts, so they were wearing shorter skirts. And women traditionally began to do things that they didn't do before. So they were drinking alcohol illegally at these fake bars called speakeasies. They were smoking, and they went out to nightclubs, and they began to think for themselves, because in 1920, women certainly had the right to vote. So what really showcased those new freedoms? The 19th Amendment in 1920 gave women the right to vote. And this vocabulary word, you better know it. Women's suffrage. They're not suffering. They're not hurt by anything. It's called suffrage, and they were able to, they were vote in national elections, right? So there is a nice image, a very popular image of a flapper from the 1920s. Wearing the shorter haircut, much more makeup, dolled up the lipstick on the lips there, right? Obviously showing a little skin there, wearing a little flaunted dress, if you will. There's the short skirts. Once again, every woman in the picture's got that short hairstyle, shorter skirts. Most women before the 1920s, those skirts went all the way down to the ankle. Now, We're going to be a raised hemline, right? Raised skirts. There's some more flappers for you, jamming it up there, hanging out on probably a Sunday afternoon. Literature. People had time, so we mentioned they went to the movies, they went to sporting events, they did things, listened to the radio. Well, they also read more, right? So the writing for the time period really expresses how our changing values were happening in the 20s, right? Some of the literature would be against the new technology and that mass consumerism or consumption that was happening at that time period. Some literature kind of criticized the whole business first mentality, money first and, working and, kind of shunned some of those material items. And some even left America. Ernest Hemingway didn't like, what was happening in America at that time. And he kind of left America and went to Europe for a while and would come back. So, the writers at this time were known as the Lost Generation because they were writing about the times that, America wasn't as free in terms of their social attitudes. They're kind of stuck in the old ways. So they didn't, make that move. So, to give you an idea here, the leading writers of the 20s, Willa Cather, novelist, wrote by Antonia, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Most kids are going to read this in high school. The Great Gatsby. You got Hemingway, Langston Hughes, some names that you might know. Sinclair Lewis, another great novelist. So there are some things about that were written by these novelists at this time that showcased maybe they weren't so happy with what was happening in America, right? One really good thing that happened in Harlem, and it would kind of spread its way throughout America, was the Renaissance. It was the time period where black people finally started to be proud of being black. And really this movement was led by a group of prominent African-American writers in Harlem. And they began to express their pride in simply being African-American, showcasing African-American culture, African-American identity, telling the story of what African-Americans contributed to America. And really, it called for an action against, this hatred towards black people and the bigotry that's out there, and it tried to prove to Americans that black people, once again, were talented. They were good people, and really the African American artists, musicians, and dancers participated in this rebirth of is finally proud to be black in America. So, Edward K. Ellington, his friends are going to call him Duke. You may have heard the name Duke Ellington, this jazz musician, right? And then Bessie Smith, the famous jazz singer from the 1920s, was known as the Empress of the Blues. So there's Duke Ellington, right? Edward's Duke Ellington, and then there's Bessie Smith singing her heart away, right? So really, that's the type of music that people were listening to in those clubs, right? Well, women's changing roles, right? Women are going to join the workforce. Women are going to work during World War I. In 1920, women got the right to vote. And once again, these women are hanging out in these clubs, wearing those shorter hemlines, shorter hair, smoking, and they're in an illegal club and they're drinking, right? So what were women doing in the workforce? Well, traditionally, before World War I, women's job, her place was in the domestic sphere, and that was in the home. So women actually began joining that workforce in the 19-teens in the World War I. So by 1930, you had 10.7 million women who are actually working. Women earned 40% of the bachelor degrees in our country. So more and more women began working. More and more women began going to colleges, and they were taking on jobs that tended to fit women: teaching, nursing, social working, things like that. Secretaries, some were salespeople, definitely telephone operators, the lady that's cutting your hair, right? The stylist, the beauticians. So women, the door began to open for women to do things traditionally that they weren't doing before. So, chances are if you had to make a phone call, first thing you did was call the operator. You're probably going to be listening to a woman behind that, and she would connect you to who you wanted to call. So women are getting involved. Now, women did not truly get involved in politics in terms of running for office, but we should know what happened to women in 1920. So women began voting legally in every state because of the 19th Amendment. Women began voting in national elections. And once again, the word for rights to vote would be suffrage, right? The only problem is when we look at the stats, the statistics from that time period, women did not come out and vote in very large numbers. They were allowed to vote, but they did not come out and vote. And it kind of shows us that, their place maybe was still kind of in that domestic sphere, in the home front. It will take a while before women vote in a national election in large numbers, right? So what actually was happening for the working classes and rights and working conditions for women? Well, Congress passed the Shepard-Towner Act. Not a big deal in terms of, I haven't seen it on an exam, but it's nice to know, right? It reduced infant mortality. So a lot of our children who were being born ended up, living and moving on with their lives, right? We developed healthcare centers and we focused on nutrition and healthcare for women in our country because they were our child barriers, and we wanted to make sure that they can continue in terms of their livelihood a healthy way. Women did propose what is known as an Equal Rights Amendment. It is known as the ERA, proposed by Alice Paul in 1923. It's never been ratified. So the Equal Rights Amendment is not a real amendment. It's not in our Constitution. But you should know that it's out there, and there's groups of people who are big proponents of having it actually ratified as an amendment. So it's a proposed amendment, but it is not an actual amendment, right? So if you ever see that ERA, you're thinking about the Equal Rights Amendment. It has to do with women, and it has to do with making sure that they are being treated by the Constitution, all right? So daily life will also change for women in terms of what's happening in the home, and that is our new technologies are going to make life really easy for women, and I would say men as well in terms of the household. So think about your household and all the products that you have inside your household. Makes your life pretty easy. Well, what changed back then? Well, women used to wash clothes by hand. Now we have washing machines, right? Women used to have to, sweep the rug. Well, you don't have to sweep the rug anymore because now you have a vacuum cleaner. Right? You don't have to go put some wood on the stove. There's actually electric and gas stoves that were made, and refrigeration really changes people's lifestyles because now you don't have to have an ice box. You can have a refrigerator. You put food in there. It doesn't spoil. Makes life really easier. And obviously, 1920s, you got your waffle iron. You put your little waffle stuff in there. You make a nice waffle. That's nice stuff, right? The Hoover vacuum cleaner. Obviously, there'll be door-to-door salesmen. This is an advertisement telling you how much the vacuum cleaner. I wish vacuum cleaners were $39. I'd go buy a ton of them. There is some ugliness that happens from the 1920s. So I think we should be aware of the things that are happening in the 1920s that are really, really ugly. So we have Prohibition. This guy's name right here, if you see his picture again, that is John T. Scopes. And in the late 1920s, there was actually a Klan march in Washington, D.C. That's the Capitol building. That's where Congress is located. So let's look at the ugliness in those threats to our freedoms that are happening in the 1920s. Well, the biggest one, you'll see this again in the 1950s, is the Red Scare. So there's a Bolshevik revolution, the communists take over in Russia, and there's a fear that some of these Russian immigrants who are coming to America are going to spread bad ideas, spread communist ideas. So you should know, if you ever see the Red Scare, who is Americans afraid of? Well, Americans were afraid of communists living in America. Now, you can't prove someone's a communist, but that's what we're afraid of. Also, there were some countries who were really leaning towards some socialistic kind of thoughts, and we're afraid that those people are going to spread bad ideas in the country. So we're afraid of people living in America who are going to spread anti-American ideas. And that is the Red Scare. So there was an attorney general, his name is A. Mitchell Palmer. There's something known as the Palmer Raids in 1919. So this is happening during the Roaring 20s, right? 33 cities, police go around, they start arresting people without any warrants. And, some of the people were actually bad, and we deported them. They were illegal aliens living in the country. But the problem with the Palmer Raids is it showcases that we're going to break into people's homes and arrest people on the thought that they might be a communist. So they really didn't commit any crimes. What does this show us, though? And we're so afraid of something, our government is willing to kind of not follow the constitutional rights that we should have and kind of just arrest people, throw them in jail, and maybe even throw them out of the country. So this is kind of a dangerous time for American freedoms and liberties, because you may be, you may be claimed to be something you're not, and therefore you're getting arrested for it. So Palmer declares aliens and Reds are to be deported. Deported is what? Kick them out of the country. All right. Well, some immigrants from certain countries spread ideas that were un-American. We established that. So what happens with Sacco and Vanzetti here, Sacco and Bartolome Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants. Now, they were well known to be anarchists. They admitted they were anarchists. They were passing out papers. They were anti-government. They both carried guns on them. And they were accused of breaking into a shoe factory and robbing it. Well, very quickly, they were convicted of murder in 1921 after that Massachusetts robbery, right? They were convicted more on their beliefs than the actual evidence. So we kind of know today that these two guys did not commit that crime, but they were convicted of it. They were electrocuted for it, but they didn't do it. So we have to look at the ugliness of the 20s here. And Sacco and Vanzetti were basically murdered because of their beliefs, not because of what they did. So we could put Sacco and Vanzetti in with the Red Scare. And once again, what are we doing with something we're afraid of? We're getting rid of it. We're taking away people's rights and getting rid of it, right? In 1977, the governor of Massachusetts actually came out publicly and said that that should have never happened. Those guys should have never been given the electrocution chair, and they basically should have been killed. So there's Sacco and Vanzetti, and it's kind of a sad story for those, right? This one's going to have a bite to it. But if we can understand the First Amendment, we understand that this group has the right to do this. So membership rose by the Klan in the 1920s. Why? They were afraid of foreigners. They were afraid of Asian immigrants who were coming in. They were afraid of those Roman Catholics that were coming in. They don't like black people. They don't like anybody who's not white and Protestant. So they added over 100,000 members to the actual Klan in the early 1920s, which is scary. All right. Who did they target? I mentioned it for you. African Americans, anybody who was Roman Catholic, Jews, and immigrants. And Klan beliefs were the only true Americans were going to be white, Protestant, and American born. So every immigrant that comes in is not going to be liked by the Klan, right? So by 1925, they actually peaked at over 2 million members. And I mean, you see this picture here, which is just crazy. I couldn't believe it. But, they had a parade in the 1920s down Pennsylvania Avenue. There's 60,000 of them in this parade. So I mentioned the First Amendment rights. We know that as we learn about our Constitution, people have the right to peacefully assemble. And the sad thing here is this group, during this daytime march, they were peacefully assembling. They weren't breaking any laws, and they were allowed to have their little march. But at night, they were targeting African Americans. They were lynching people, and basically, it's going to take a while for the government to be able to curtail that. It's sad. And then another picture of the Klan marching, right? Yeah, that's D.C., 1925. Crazy. Well, our government actually does react to the growing opposition to the Reds, the growing opposition to communists and socialists, the activities of the Klan. So what did our government finally do? Well, immigrants were seen as they're going to take jobs from soldiers and World War I and those guys coming back home. Immigrants were seen as threatening to some of our American core values. So what we begin to do is we begin to say, hey, maybe we should limit the amount of immigrants coming in. So the word then for anti-immigration are nativists, or the ideas of nativism, right? Nativism is on the rise. You can definitely put the Klan in that nativist group. They did not like immigrants, right? Klans are nativists. Well, our government finally sets up what's known as the Immigration Act of 1924. And what it does, it sets up a system of quotas. So basically, our government's going to say, we're only going to take a certain percentage of people from Italy. We're only going to take a certain number of people each year from Greece. And what that did was it put a limit on how many immigrants were going to come into the country, right? Limited the number of immigrants from each country. It was deliberately set the numbers for each country were deliberately really low from those countries who we were worried about who they were sending or who was coming. So really it's going to be from that Eastern and Southern Europe. So countries like, Greece and Italy and Poland and Russia. And we're going to try to keep those numbers really low. And basically that law also excluded all immigrants from Asia. So no more Asians into the country. So if you see this, picture this being before 1924, all these immigrants were actually allowed into the country. And what are we doing now? We're kind of putting the kibosh on that, and we're making it so we're only going to let a certain number through from each country. So obviously you can see immigration in the United States. What do you got right in here? 1921 and 1930. Right after that 1924 law, what happens to immigration? The numbers get really low because we did not want those groups coming in because of the Red Scare and because we're afraid they're going to spread some bad ideas. So the last thing was kind of an experiment that our government did, and that is called Prohibition. Prohibition was when our government decided that having alcohol was going to be illegal. You just can't have it. You can't manufacture it. You can't sell it. Can't drink it. Well, why did this come about? Because of something known as the temperance movement. And the people behind the temperance movement are going to be your women, your factory owners, and your religious organizations, right? So they're working for prohibition, which is banning the sale and consumption of alcohol. Basically, the law states you just can't have it. So what is it? The 18th Amendment? The 18th Amendment says that prohibition is going to be a thing in America. And the Volstead Act was enacted by Congress to make sure that the laws were going to be followed. Now, you and I both know what happened during the 1920s. People wanted to drink, so what's the negative? People were drinking. People would smuggle in alcohol. They would smuggle it from Canada, or they would just brew it in their bathtubs or have it like a home brew of something. The bootleggers would be the people who distributed the booze illegally, because the law says that having alcohol is totally illegal. And then organized crime develops, and guys like Al Capone, who ran Chicago, who ran all of these little illegal bars. And it just showed us that so many people wanted to drink that the government really couldn't stop it. So the 21st Amendment in 1933 made alcohol legal again. So now you can make it, you can produce it, you can drink it. 18th Amendment got rid of alcohol. 21st Amendment brought it back. So why I have prohibition under the negative issue was the government made a law they couldn't enforce, and everybody was drinking, and everybody was breaking the law. So it's kind of a negative time for America, right? U.S. is voted by, right? January 16th ratifies the Dry Amendment. So 1919 is the 18th Amendment. Here are federal agents, and what are they doing with that beer? They're dumping it into the sewer because, once again, alcohol is illegal, and Al Capone is selling the alcohol. He got arrested finally, and that's an illegal bar that's operating. And the last thing that's out there is the Scopes trial. Happens in Dayton, Tennessee. There was a battle between scientific ideas and Charles Darwin, who said, we came from monkeys, right? And the Protestants are saying, hey, we came from God. So when we look at the Scopes trial, we really have to determine who's correct here. And who is correct? I don't know. Is science correct, or is the Bible correct? You have to make that decision, right? So John Scopes was a science teacher in Tennessee, in a really religious town, Dayton, Tennessee, and he was teaching in his biology class that men and women evolved from monkeys. He was teaching the theory of evolution, and he was fined, he was arrested, all kinds of stuff. There's a huge trial about should he be able to do this or not, and William Jennings Bryan represented the church, or the fundamentalist views, and he said that absolutely man came from God, and Clarence Darrow said, hey, science could be right, and we could have come from monkeys. And Scopes was convicted. He had to pay a fine. There's John T. Scopes, and what it really showed us, there's William Jennings Bryan, Clarence Darrow. What it really showed us there is we're battling. Society is battling between who? Is science correct, or is religion correct? I don't know. I'll find out when I die, right? So that's pretty much the Roaring *20s. So if you can answer that question at the end, you might want to pick out 3 really good things and 3 really bad things that happen as a result of the Roaring '20s. So I'm going to let you guys cruise here, and we'll see you soon.